A father's promise. Daniel Whittaker was born with Down syndrome, but he never saw it as a limitation. His parents, Thomas and Mary Whittaker, had always told him that he was capable of anything if he worked hard enough. Growing up in the quiet town of Evergreen Hills, Daniel learned that while kindness was freely given by some, others only saw his condition first. He didn't let that define him. By the time he was in his 20s, he had built a steady life. He worked at a small bookstore, finding solace in the neatly stacked pages of countless stories. He had his own tiny apartment, kept spotlessly clean, and a community of people who appreciated his warmth. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving in his own way. But then, fate had another chapter planned for him. It all began when he met her, an unexpected connection. The first time Daniel met Claire Reynolds, he thought she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. She had kind eyes, a bright smile, and a laugh that sounded like the wind chimes outside his window on a breezy afternoon. Claire had moved to Evergreen Hills to take care of her ailing mother. She was a preschool teacher in a neighboring town and often visited the bookstore to pick up stories for her students. One day, as she struggled to balance a stack of books, Daniel stepped forward. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice gentle. Claire looked at him and smiled. "That would be amazing. Thank you." As he took half the books from her arms, she studied him curiously. Unlike others, she didn't look at him with pity or assumption. She simply saw a kind man helping her. That small moment was the start of something neither of them had expected. Over the next few months, they became fast friends. Daniel would recommend books, and Claire would talk about her students, laughing as she shared the misadventures of 5-year-olds with endless curiosity. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt like someone truly saw him. And then, something even more incredible happened. Claire fell in love with him, breaking expectations. Not everyone understood their relationship. Claire's friends were polite but skeptical. Her family, however, was far less subtle. Claire, her sister Olivia, had said one evening, "Are you sure about this? I mean, Daniel is different. Are you ready for what that means?" Claire's jaw tightened. "Different doesn't mean incapable, Olivia. I love him, and that's all that matters." But love wasn't always enough to shield them from society's judgment. Daniel was no stranger to stares or whispered conversations. He had lived his entire life being underestimated. But when he overheard a group of men at the bookstore murmuring, "She could do better. He won't be able to provide for a family," something inside him hardened. That night, as he walked Claire home, he finally voiced his fears. "Do you ever wish you were with someone else? Someone who could give you more?" Claire stopped walking and took his hands in hers. "Daniel, you give me more than anyone ever has. You give me kindness, laughter, and love. That's all I need." That was the moment Daniel promised himself that no matter what the world thought, he would prove them all wrong. He would be the best husband, the best partner, and one day, the best father. The joy and fear of fatherhood. A year later, they were married in a small ceremony surrounded by their closest friends and family. A few months after that, Claire surprised Daniel with the news that would change their lives forever. "You're going to be a dad," she whispered, placing his hand on her stomach. Daniel's breath caught. His heart pounded. He had never been this scared in his life. Not when he had faced bullying in school, not when he had struggled to find work, and not even when people told him he wouldn't be capable of living on his own. This was different. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted one evening, sitting beside Claire on their couch. She rested her head against his shoulder. "No one really knows if they can do it, Daniel. But I do know this. You will love our child more than anything in the world, and that's the most important thing a father can do." That night, Daniel placed his hands on Claire's stomach and whispered his first promise to his unborn child. "I'll do my best," he murmured. "I'll always be here. I won't let you down." A life turned upside down. But fate is cruel. As Claire's pregnancy progressed, complications arose. What had started as simple fatigue became something much worse. She was placed on bed rest, and Daniel had to take on more responsibilities, working, taking care of her, preparing for the baby. He didn't complain. He read every parenting book he could find, asked endless questions at doctor's appointments, and practiced changing diapers on a teddy bear he had bought. Then, the worst happened. Claire went into labor early. The doctors did everything they could, but the complications were too severe. Daniel sat in the hospital waiting room, his hands gripping his knees, praying for a miracle. When the doctor finally came out, his expression told Daniel everything. "We did everything we could," the doctor said softly. "Claire, she didn't make it." Daniel's world shattered. He felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, like he was drowning but couldn't move. His Claire, the love of his life, was gone. And in her place, she had left him a son, a tiny, fragile baby who needed him now more than ever. The nurse handed him the small bundle, and Daniel looked down at his son for the first time. Ethan. He had Claire's eyes. Tears streamed down Daniel's face as he whispered, "I don't know how to do this without you, Claire." The baby stirred, his tiny fingers wrapping around Daniel's thumb. And just like that, Daniel remembered the promise he had made. No matter how hard it would be, no matter what the world said, he would not let his son down. A father's burden, a son's light. Daniel Whittaker sat in the quiet hospital room, his newborn son sleeping in his arms. The room still smelled of antiseptic and faint traces of Claire's perfume from the belongings she had left behind. But she was gone, and nothing. Not the nurse's reassurances, not the baby's soft breathing, not even the warm weight of Ethan against his chest, could make that fact any less real. He had lost the love of his life, but he had gained a piece of her. And now somehow he had to be both mother and father. The first night alone, when Daniel stepped through the door of their small apartment, Ethan bundled in his arms, the silence nearly crushed him. Everything reminded him of Claire. The half-folded baby clothes she had been preparing, the parenting books stacked neatly on the nightstand, the framed wedding photo where they had both been laughing, as if they had all the time in the world. But time had stolen Claire away. And now it was just him and Ethan. The first night was chaos. Ethan cried, loud, piercing wails that shattered the silence of the apartment. Daniel tried everything, rocking him, humming lullabies, even calling the hospital for advice. Babies cry, the nurse had said kindly. Sometimes they just need comfort. Comfort. Daniel wasn't sure he had any left to give, but he sat down in the rocking chair Claire had insisted on buying, held Ethan close, and whispered stories to him. Stories about Claire. She loved sunflowers, he murmured, his voice raw. She said they always found the light, no matter what. Ethan's cries softened, his tiny body relaxing against Daniel's chest. And for the first time since Claire's death, Daniel let himself cry too. The doubts of others. The next few weeks passed in a blur of exhaustion and learning. Every diaper change was a battle. Feeding times were unpredictable. Sleep was a luxury Daniel couldn't afford. But the hardest part wasn't the sleepless nights or the never-ending cycle of feeding, burping, and rocking Ethan to sleep. It was them. The people who didn't believe in him. Daniel, his sister-in-law, Marissa said one afternoon, watching him struggle to mix formula while Ethan wailed in the background. "Are you sure this is the best thing for him? Maybe someone else should raise him." Daniel stiffened. "I'm his father. I know, but this is a lot for you." Daniel turned to face her, his hands trembling from exhaustion and frustration. "Claire trusted me. I trust me. That's enough." But was it? Because when Ethan had colic and cried for hours, when Daniel was too tired to even think, when he looked at the world outside his window and saw families with two parents, laughter and support, he wondered if he was being selfish. Could he really do this alone? A job and a sacrifice. Money was another battle. Daniel had taken time off from the bookstore, but time wasn't free. Bills piled up. Baby supplies ran out faster than he could have imagined. He needed a job. The bookstore couldn't offer flexible hours, and most businesses weren't eager to hire a single father who might need to leave at a moment's notice. Then an opportunity came. Lou's Diner. It was a 24-hour greasy spoon, the kind of place where the coffee never stopped flowing and the customers never stopped talking. The manager, Lou, was a gruff but fair man in his 50s who gave Daniel a long, hard look when he came in asking for a job. "You ever worked in food service before?" "No." "You ever worked nights?" Daniel hesitated. "No." Lou sighed, rubbing his temples. "And you got a newborn at home?" "Yes." The man stared at him for a long moment before nodding. "All right, kid. I'll give you a shot. But if you can't keep up, I can't keep you." Daniel nodded. "I'll keep up." And so, his new life began. The night shift struggle. The first shift nearly broke him. Orders were shouted across the kitchen. The heat from the stove was suffocating. Customers complained, dishes piled up, and his feet ached before the first hour was even over. But quitting wasn't an option. So he worked. And when his shift ended at 5 a.m., he rushed home, exhausted beyond reason, just in time for Ethan's morning feeding. This became his life. Work all night, care for Ethan all day, sleep whenever he could, which was barely at all. And still, the doubts came. Neighbors whispered. Some of Claire's family members insisted he should give Ethan up for adoption. And every time he stumbled through the door after a shift, his body screaming for rest, he wondered if they were right. Then, one night, Ethan fell asleep in his arms, his tiny fingers curled around Daniel's shirt. And Daniel knew. It didn't matter how tired he was. It didn't matter what people thought. He had promised Claire. He had promised Ethan. And he wasn't going to let them down. A kindness in the chaos. One evening, as Daniel stood behind the counter at Lou's, exhausted but determined, a customer caught his attention. She was a woman in her 40s, well-dressed, with tired eyes. She watched him for a long time before finally speaking. "You're the single dad, right?" Daniel straightened, wary. "Yes." She nodded. "I lost my husband last year. I have 2 kids. It's hard, isn't it?" Daniel didn't answer right away. But then he nodded. "Yeah, it is." She placed a $20 bill on the counter. "Buy yourself and your kid something nice." Daniel stared at the money, unsure whether to feel grateful or ashamed. But the woman just smiled. "It's not charity. It's just from one struggling parent to another." That night, Daniel used the money to buy Ethan a warm blanket. And for the first time in months, he felt something close to hope. The bond it couldn't break. Months passed. Daniel's exhaustion became a constant, but so did Ethan's laughter. The tiny baby who had once felt like an impossible responsibility was now a giggling, bright-eyed child who reached for Daniel whenever he walked in the door. One night, after his shift, Daniel collapsed onto the couch. He had barely shut his eyes when he felt a tiny hand on his face. He opened his eyes to see Ethan, standing unsteadily on his little legs, looking down at him. Then, for the first time, Ethan spoke. "Duh." Daniel's breath caught. "Dada." It was barely more than a whisper, but it was the most beautiful sound Daniel had ever heard. He gathered Ethan into his arms, pressing a kiss to his son's forehead. "I love you," he murmured, "no matter what." And in that moment, as exhaustion melted into something softer, something warmer, Daniel knew. He wasn't just surviving. He was living. And so was Ethan. Together. A father's strength, a child's world. Daniel Whittaker had survived the first year of fatherhood by sheer willpower. Each day was an uphill climb, but every challenge he faced only deepened his resolve. He was a single father. He was Ethan's father. And no matter how exhausted he was, how much doubt the world threw at him, He would never let his son feel alone. But as Ethan grew, so did the challenges. The sleepless nights became busy mornings. The cries of a newborn were replaced by the laughter and boundless energy of a toddler. And while Daniel had conquered the first year of diapers and midnight feedings, he quickly realized parenthood wasn't going to get easier. It was just getting started. A home built on love. The apartment was small, a tiny two-bedroom space on the second floor of an aging brick building, where the pipes rattled in the winter and the neighbors played their television too loudly at night. But inside, it was theirs. Daniel had turned the second bedroom into a nursery when Ethan was born. Now, as Ethan neared his third birthday, Daniel spent his rare free hours transforming it into a real bedroom, a space where his son could grow. The walls were covered in soft blue paint, decorated with stars and planets Daniel had carefully painted by hand. A small bookshelf stood in the corner, filled with storybooks Daniel had collected over the years. The bed was small, but sturdy. Daniel had built it himself. And above it, taped carefully to the wall, was a picture of Claire. Ethan didn't understand yet. He knew the woman in the picture was Mama, but he didn't ask questions. Not yet. One evening, after a long shift at Lou's Diner, Daniel sat cross-legged on the floor, helping Ethan stack colorful wooden blocks into a tower. Ethan giggled as he placed the last block on top. "Tall," he announced. Daniel smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "Yeah, buddy, you made it real tall." Then, with the mischief only a toddler could manage, Ethan smacked the tower with both hands, sending blocks flying in every direction. Daniel gasped dramatically. "You destroyed it." Ethan erupted into laughter, his little body shaking as he clapped his hands in delight. Daniel chuckled, scooping his son into his arms. This was their life. Small moments, simple joys, a home built not on wealth, but on love. The judgment of strangers. As much as Daniel tried to shelter Ethan from the judgment of others, it was impossible to escape it entirely. It happened one afternoon at the grocery store. Daniel had worked a long shift the night before and barely managed a few hours of sleep, but the fridge was empty and Ethan needed food. So he loaded his son into the shopping cart and headed to the store. Things were fine until they reached the checkout line. Daniel fumbled with his wallet, his hands shaking from exhaustion. He was moving too slowly. He could feel the people behind him growing impatient. The woman directly behind him sighed loudly. "Unbelievable," she muttered. Daniel pretended not to hear. But then she spoke again. "I don't know why they let people like him have kids," she whispered to the man beside her. "It's irresponsible." Daniel's entire body went still. For a moment, he considered turning around, saying something, defending himself. But then Ethan, oblivious to the world's cruelty, reached up and tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy?" he asked, his bright eyes filled with innocent concern. Daniel exhaled slowly, forcing himself to let go of the anger curling inside his chest. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. Instead, he smiled down at his son, ruffled his hair, and finished paying. As they left the store, Daniel held Ethan a little tighter. The world would always be cruel, but he would always be kind. A father's resolve. Despite the whispers, the doubts, the exhaustion, Daniel pressed forward. He worked long nights at the diner. He spent his mornings reading to Ethan, playing with him, and teaching him about the world. He refused to let the doubts of others define him. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Ethan climbed into Daniel's lap with a picture book. "Read?" he asked. Daniel smiled. "Of course, buddy." Ethan's tiny fingers flipped through the pages, pointing to the colorful illustrations. But then he stopped at a picture of a mother bear and her cub. Ethan frowned. "Where's my mama?" Daniel's breath caught. It was the first time Ethan had asked. He had always known this moment would come, but that didn't make it any easier. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice to stay steady. "Your mama was very special," he said softly. She loved you so much. Ethan tilted his head. She's gone. Daniel nodded, his throat tight. Yeah, buddy, she's gone. Ethan considered this for a long moment. Then, he reached up and patted Daniel's cheek with his small hands. It's okay, he said. I have you. Daniel closed his eyes, pressing a kiss to his son's forehead. Yeah, he whispered. You do. A lesson in strength. By the time Ethan turned 5, he was a bright, curious child who asked endless questions about everything. But as he grew older, the world grew harsher. One afternoon, Daniel picked Ethan up from daycare, as he always did, but something was different. Ethan was quiet. Too quiet. On the walk home, Daniel finally asked, "What's wrong, buddy?" Ethan hesitated before looking up. The other kid said, "I don't have a real daddy." Daniel's stomach twisted. What? They said my daddy is different. Daniel stopped walking. He crouched down to meet Ethan's eyes, his hands resting gently on his son's shoulders. Do you think I'm different? He asked softly. Ethan frowned. No, you're my daddy. Daniel smiled. That's all that matters. Ethan nodded, but he still looked uncertain. So Daniel took his hand, held it tight, and walked the rest of the way home. Later that night, as Ethan curled up in bed, Daniel sat beside him. You know what he said, being different isn't bad. Ethan peeked up at him. It's not. Nope. It means you see the world in a way no one else does. And that's pretty special. Ethan grinned, like a superhero. Daniel chuckled. Yeah, just like a superhero. As Ethan drifted off to sleep, Daniel sat there for a long time, watching his son breathe. The world would always judge them. But Ethan would grow up knowing that love, real, unconditional love, was stronger than any doubt. And Daniel, he wasn't just a father. He was Ethan's hero, the strength of a father's love. By the time Ethan was 7 years old, Daniel had mastered the art of balancing exhaustion with devotion. He had learned how to function on 3 hours of sleep, how to stretch a paycheck to cover food, rent, and school supplies, and how to navigate the never-ending questions that came with raising a child. But there were some things no amount of preparation could shield him from. The doubts, the whispers, the way the world looked at him and saw only his condition, not the man he had fought to become. Daniel had expected judgment from adults. What he hadn't expected was how deeply it would begin to affect Ethan. The schoolyard cruelty. It started with small things. A classmate's offhanded comment, a hesitant glance from a teacher, the way some of the other parents never quite met Daniel's eyes during school events. Ethan didn't talk about it at first, but Daniel noticed. The way his son hesitated before inviting friends over, the forced smiles when Daniel picked him up from school, the way his shoulders tensed when other children ran past them in the halls. One evening, as Daniel cooked dinner, a simple spaghetti dish he had perfected over the years, he finally asked, "Everything okay at school, buddy?" Ethan, sitting at the kitchen table, shrugged. "It's fine." Daniel turned off the stove. "Ethan," he said gently, taking the seat across from him, "talk to me." Ethan hesitated, pushing his fork through the noodles on his plate. "The kids at school," he mumbled. "They say you're different." Daniel's heart clenched, but he kept his voice calm. "What do you mean?" "They say you're not like the other dads." Daniel swallowed the familiar ache. He had spent his whole life being told he wasn't like everyone else. Now his son was carrying that weight too. "Do you think that's a bad thing?" Daniel asked carefully. Ethan didn't answer right away. Then, finally, he shook his head. "No, but they make it sound like it is." Daniel reached across the table, resting a hand over his son's small one. "People fear what they don't understand," he said. "But being different doesn't mean being less. It means seeing the world in a way no one else can." Ethan's eyes were wide as he absorbed the words. "Like a superhero." Daniel chuckled. "Yeah, just like a superhero." Ethan grinned, but the conversation lingered in Daniel's mind long after dinner was over. Because he knew. This was only the beginning. The parent-teacher meeting. A few weeks later, Daniel received a note from Ethan's teacher, Mrs. Callahan, requesting a meeting. He arrived at the school dressed in his best shirt, neatly ironed, despite the exhaustion clinging to his bones. Mrs. Callahan was a kind woman in her 50s, but there was hesitation in her voice as she spoke. "Mr. Whittaker," she began, folding her hands on her desk, "Ethan is a bright child. He's kind, curious, and always eager to learn." Daniel smiled. "That's my boy." She hesitated. "But," she continued carefully, "he's been having a hard time socially." Daniel's stomach sank. "What do you mean?" "There have been comments," Mrs. Callahan admitted, "from some of the other children. About you." Daniel stiffened. "About me?" She nodded. "Children repeat what they hear at home. Some of the parents. They'd voiced concerns about whether or not you're capable of raising Ethan on your own." Daniel inhaled slowly, steadying himself. "And what do you think?" he asked. Mrs. Callahan met his gaze. "I think Ethan is lucky to have a father who loves him as much as you do." Relief flooded Daniel's chest. "But," she continued, "he needs support. He needs to know that no matter what anyone says, he belongs here." Daniel nodded. "I'll make sure he knows." Because Ethan did belong. And no amount of whispered doubts could change that. The father-son picnic. A month later, the school held its annual father-son picnic. Ethan hesitated when he brought the flyer home. "We don't have to go," he mumbled. Daniel frowned. "Why not?" Ethan shifted on his feet. "Some of the kids, they might say stuff." Daniel crouched down in front of him, resting his hands on his son's shoulders. "Do you want to go?" he asked. Ethan hesitated. Then, finally, he nodded. "Yeah." Daniel smiled. "Then we'll go." And so, that Saturday, Daniel showed up at the picnic with Ethan's hand firmly in his. The event was held at the town park, filled with fathers tossing footballs, grilling burgers, and laughing over stories. Daniel could feel the stares the moment they arrived. He ignored them. Instead, he focused on Ethan, helping him set up their picnic blanket, tossing a baseball back and forth, laughing as they tried, and failed, to fly a kite. At one point, a group of fathers stood nearby, talking in hushed voices. "Can't believe he actually showed up," one of them muttered. Daniel's jaw tightened, but before he could say anything, Ethan turned to him, his eyes bright. "This is the best picnic ever, Dad." And just like that, the whispers didn't matter, because in Ethan's eyes, Daniel was enough. A lesson in courage. That night, as they walked home, Ethan looked up at him. "Dad?" "Yeah, buddy." "I don't care what the other kids say," Ethan announced. "You're the best dad ever." Daniel smiled, his throat tight with emotion. "Thanks, buddy." Ethan grinned. "And I don't care if they think you're different." Daniel stopped walking, crouching down to meet his son's eyes. "Being different isn't a bad thing," he said softly. Ethan nodded. "I know. It means we're superheroes." Daniel chuckled, pulling his son into a tight hug. Because he knew, no matter what the world threw at them, no matter how many whispers or doubts they faced, Ethan would be okay. Because Ethan knew he was loved. And in the end, that was all that mattered. A father's strength, a child's world. The father-son picnic had been a turning point, but the world wasn't done testing them yet. As Ethan grew, so did the weight of the outside world. The whispers, the expectations, the judgment that followed Daniel wherever he went. And though Ethan tried to ignore it, to brush off the comments like they meant nothing, there were days when he couldn't. Days when the weight of being Daniel Whittaker's son felt heavier than he could carry. The birthday party that changed everything. Ethan was 8 when he received an invitation to a classmate's birthday party. It was the first time he had been invited to a big event outside of school, a party at a trampoline park with cake, games, and a dozen other kids. He had been excited at first, running home with the invitation clutched in his small hands. "Can I go, Dad?" he asked eagerly. Daniel smiled. Of course, buddy. But then, Ethan hesitated. You don't have to come, he added quickly. It's just for kids. Daniel frowned. Parents are allowed, right? Yeah, but, Ethan bit his lip. You're busy. And it's just a party. Daniel knelt in front of his son. Ethan, do you not want me to come? Ethan hesitated. Then slowly he nodded. Some of the kids might say stuff. Daniel swallowed the familiar ache that came with those words. But he forced a smile. Okay, buddy. If you want to go on your own, that's fine. Ethan grinned, relieved. Thanks, Dad. That Saturday, Daniel dropped Ethan off at the trampoline park, watching as he ran inside with a bright smile. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he belonged. Until he didn't. The cruelty of children. It started small. A few whispered words behind cupped hands. A few sideways glances. Then, louder. Your dad's weird. Ethan ignored it. But the comments didn't stop. My mom says he's not normal. Ethan's stomach clenched. He tried to pretend he didn't hear. But then Ryan, the same boy who had made fun of him before, smirked. Bet he can't even help you with your homework. Can he even read? Laughter. Ethan's face burned. He wanted to scream. To tell them they were wrong. That his dad could read. That he was the best storyteller in the world. That he worked harder than any of their parents ever had. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he grabbed his coat and ran. A heartbreaking truth. Daniel had just finished washing dishes when the front door swung open. Ethan stormed inside, throwing his backpack onto the floor. Daniel turned, surprised. Hey, buddy. You're back early. How was? Why can't you be like the other dads? Ethan blurted out. Daniel froze. Ethan's eyes were wet with unshed tears, his small fists clenched at his sides. Why do you have to be different? Daniel felt like he had been punched in the chest. Ethan, his voice cracked. Ethan shook his head. The other kids. He swallowed. They laugh at you. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel's heart ached, but he took a steady breath and knelt in front of his son. Do you think I'm not good enough? Ethan's lip trembled. I don't know, he whispered. Daniel closed his eyes, swallowing the pain that threatened to spill over. Then he opened them and cupped Ethan's small face in his hands. Listen to me, buddy. I know it's hard. I know people talk. I know they don't understand. Ethan blinked up at him, his chest rising and falling quickly. But I love you, Daniel continued. And no matter what anyone says, that will never change. Ethan sniffled. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Ethan threw his arms around his father's neck. I'm sorry, Dad, he whispered. Daniel held him tight. You never have to be sorry for how you feel, buddy. Ethan nodded, his small hands gripping the fabric of Daniel's shirt. I love you, Ethan murmured. Daniel smiled, pressing a kiss to the top of his son's head. I love you more. A father's resolve. That night, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring at the old photo of Claire on the wall. I'm doing my best, he whispered. The world would always see him as less, but he wasn't raising his son to believe in the world's judgment. He was raising him to believe in love, because in the end, that was all that truly mattered, and no amount of whispers could ever take that away. A son's struggle, a father's sacrifice. Years passed like the turning pages of a well-loved book, each chapter bringing new challenges, new lessons, and new tests of resilience. By the time Ethan was 13, childhood innocence had been replaced by the first shadows of adolescence. Middle school was a battlefield of social hierarchies, whispered gossip, and silent judgments. And Daniel, who had once been Ethan's whole world, was now a source of quiet embarrassment. It wasn't that Ethan didn't love his father. He did. But love and pride were two different things. And in a world where fitting in felt like survival, Daniel's presence made Ethan feel like an outsider. The growing distance. It started with small things. Ethan no longer ran to Daniel after school, eager to share his day. His bedtime stories, once sacred, became something he outgrew. He spent more time at friends' houses, coming home late, answering questions with short nods and mumbled replies. Daniel noticed. He noticed the way Ethan hesitated before introducing him to new friends, the way he no longer held Daniel's hand in public, the way he seemed to shrink whenever someone made an offhand comment about his special dad. But Daniel never said anything, because he understood. Ethan was growing up, and the world was making him choose between acceptance and authenticity. The whispered insults. One afternoon, Daniel arrived at school for parent-teacher conferences. He had taken extra care with his appearance, pressed shirt, neatly combed hair, wanting to make a good impression. But as he walked down the hallway, he heard them. A group of students whispering near the lockers. "That's his dad." "Yeah, he works at that diner." "Right. He talks kinda weird. My mom says he shouldn't even have a kid." Daniel stopped mid-step. The words shouldn't have hurt. He had heard them all his life. But when he turned and saw Ethan, standing just a few feet away, frozen, eyes wide with humiliation, his heart broke. Ethan's face was pale. Their eyes met. And in that moment, Daniel knew. Ethan wasn't just hearing the insults. He was believing them. The dinner table silence. That evening, Ethan barely spoke. He picked at his food, shoulders tense, eyes avoiding his father's. Daniel wanted to say something, to tell him that what those kids had said didn't matter, that he didn't care what the world thought. But Ethan did. So Daniel stayed quiet, until Ethan finally broke the silence. "Dad." He hesitated. Daniel looked up. "Yeah, buddy." Ethan's fingers tightened around his fork. "Do you ever wish you were normal?" The words hit Daniel like a slap. He swallowed, keeping his voice steady. "What do you mean?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "I mean, do you ever wish you were like the other dads?" Daniel set down his fork, his hands suddenly unsteady. "Ethan, is that what you want?" Ethan's jaw clenched. "I don't know. I don't want people to laugh at me anymore." Daniel's chest ached. Not because of what Ethan said, but because of what he didn't say. His son, the boy he had raised, the boy he had sacrificed everything for, was ashamed of him. And the worst part, Daniel understood, because he had spent his whole life being ashamed of himself. The father-son argument. The distance between them only grew in the months that followed. Ethan avoided school events where Daniel might be seen. He rarely brought friends over. And then, one evening, the simmering tension between them finally boiled over. Daniel had been working late at the diner, covering extra shifts to save for Ethan's high school expenses. By the time he got home, he was exhausted. But Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table, arms crossed, a deep frown on his face. "Where were you?" Daniel blinked. "I told you, buddy. I had work." Ethan scoffed. "You always have work." Daniel sighed, setting down his keys. "I'm trying my best, Ethan." "Well, it's not enough," Ethan snapped. The words hung in the air. Daniel exhaled slowly. "What do you mean?" Ethan stood up, fists clenched. "I mean, I'm tired of people looking at me like I'm different because of you. I'm tired of the whispers, the pity, everything." Daniel's heart clenched. "Ethan, why couldn't I have a normal dad?" Silence. The kind that shattered everything. Daniel looked at his son, the boy he had raised with every ounce of love in his heart, and felt something inside him break. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, quietly, he said, "I'm sorry you feel that way." Ethan's face crumbled. "Dad, I didn't mean." But Daniel was already walking away. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if his love was enough. The breaking point. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at an old photograph of Claire. He traced the edges with his fingers, his chest heavy with emotions he didn't have the words for. Am I failing him? Is he better off without me? For the first time, the thought crept in, uninvited, unwelcome. Maybe Ethan would have a better life without the burden of being his son. Maybe love wasn't enough. Maybe. The sound of soft footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Ethan stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes red from crying. "Dad," he whispered. "I'm sorry." Daniel exhaled. "Come here, buddy." Ethan crossed the room hesitantly. Daniel pulled him into a hug. "I didn't mean it." Ethan choked. "I don't want a different dad." Daniel closed his eyes, holding him tighter. "I know, buddy. I know." And in that moment, the broken pieces of their bond started to heal. A son's realization. The years that followed weren't perfect. There were still whispers, still struggles. But as Ethan grew older, he began to see the world differently. One night, when he was 16, he walked into the diner after school, watching as his father, exhausted but smiling, cleaned the counters. Daniel saw him and grinned. "Hey, buddy." And for the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel ashamed. He felt proud, because this was his dad, the man who had raised him with love and patience, the man who had sacrificed everything for him, the man who, no matter what the world said, had never given up on him. And Ethan realized his father was the strongest person he had ever known. A father's legacy, a son's promise. Years passed, and life continued its relentless march forward. Ethan Whittaker grew into a man. The boy who had once questioned his father's place in the world now stood at the threshold of adulthood, carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken lessons. And Daniel, his father, his protector, his constant, grew older. The lines on his face deepened, his hands became slower, and the exhaustion he had once fought so fiercely began to catch up with him. But his love never wavered, even when his body did. Even when time, unforgiving and cruel, forced Ethan to realize that his father would not always be there. A son's departure. At 18, Ethan left home for college. It wasn't a far move, just a few towns over. Close enough to visit, but far enough to feel like the start of something new. His acceptance letter had arrived in a crisp white envelope, thick with opportunity and promise. But with it came something heavier. The knowledge that for the first time in his life, he would be walking forward without his father beside him. The night before he left, Ethan found Daniel in the kitchen, sitting at their worn wooden table, a cup of tea in front of him. He hesitated before speaking. "Dad?" Daniel looked up, his smile small but warm. "Yeah, buddy." Ethan swallowed, the words feeling heavy in his throat. "What are you gonna do when I'm gone?" Daniel chuckled. "I'll keep living, Ethan, just like I always have." Ethan frowned. "But it's always been us, just the two of us." Daniel nodded, his eyes soft. "And it always will be. Even if you're not here, you're still my son. And I'm still your dad. Nothing changes that." Ethan sat down across from him, running a hand through his hair. "I'm scared." Daniel reached across the table, covering Ethan's hand with his own. "I know," he said, "but you're ready." Ethan exhaled, gripping his father's hand tightly. "I'll come home all the time," he promised. Daniel smiled. "I know you will." But they both knew this was the beginning of something different. Something neither of them could stop. A father's sacrifice, a son's gratitude. College was a whirlwind. New experiences, new friends, new struggles. But no matter how busy Ethan became, he called his father every night. And every night, Daniel answered with the same warm, familiar voice. "Hey, buddy, how was your day?" Ethan would talk about classes, about professors, about the things he was learning. And Daniel, who had never been to college, who had never sat in a lecture hall or written a research paper, listened as if it was the most important thing in the world. Because to him, it was. What Ethan didn't know, what he wouldn't realize until much later, was the sacrifice Daniel had made to get him there. how he had taken on extra shifts at the diner, how he had quietly skipped meals so that Ethan could afford textbooks, how he had ignored the worsening pain in his joints, the dizziness that sometimes overtook him, because he refused to be a burden. Ethan didn't see it. Not yet. But time would reveal it all. And when it did, it would break him. The moment that changed everything. It happened during Ethan's 3rd year of college. A call, late at night. Not from Daniel. From Lou, the manager of the diner. Ethan. Lou's voice was heavy. Your dad collapsed at work. Ethan's heart stopped. What? What happened? He's in the hospital, Lou said. It's bad, kid. You should come home. Ethan didn't remember the drive back. Didn't remember parking, running through the hospital doors, or the sharp scent of antiseptic in the air. All he remembered was seeing his father, his strong, unbreakable father, lying in a hospital bed, looking smaller than he ever had before. Ethan sank into the chair beside him, gripping his hand. Dad? Daniel's eyes fluttered open. He smiled, tired but warm. Hey, buddy. Ethan swallowed back the lump in his throat. What happened? Daniel chuckled weakly. Guess I pushed myself a little too hard. Ethan's grip tightened. Why didn't you tell me? Daniel sighed, his fingers curling around Ethan's. Because you have your own life to live, son. I didn't want to slow you down. Ethan felt something crack inside him. You are not slowing me down, he said fiercely. You're my dad. I would drop everything for you. Daniel's eyes softened. I know you would, but I don't want you to. Ethan shook his head. That's not how this works. You took care of me my whole life. Now it's my turn. For the first time in his life, Daniel didn't argue. Because he saw it. Ethan wasn't a boy anymore. He was a man, and he was ready to carry the weight his father had carried for so long. A son's tribute, a father's legacy. Daniel recovered, but he wasn't the same. The years of hard work, of sacrifice, of always putting Ethan first, had taken their toll. His hands shook more often, his steps were slower, and Ethan knew his father wouldn't be around forever. So he made a decision. When Ethan graduated from college, he didn't take a high-paying corporate job. Instead, he returned home, and using everything he had saved, he opened the Whitaker Family Community Center, a place for single parents, struggling families, and anyone who needed help. A place built on the lessons Daniel had taught him, the lessons of love, of sacrifice, of strength. At the grand opening, Daniel sat in the front row, his eyes filled with tears as he looked up at the sign bearing their name. You did this, he whispered. Ethan knelt beside him, gripping his father's hand. No, he said. We did this. Daniel smiled, his heart full. Because in that moment, he knew his life had meant something. And his son, his beautiful, strong, incredible son, was his greatest legacy. The final goodbye. Years passed. Ethan got married, had children of his own. And through it all, Daniel was there, watching, smiling, proud beyond words. Until the day came when he wasn't. It was peaceful, a quiet morning. Daniel had gone to sleep and simply never woken up. Ethan sat beside his father's bed, holding his still hand, tears streaming down his face. Thank you, he whispered, for everything. And even though Daniel was gone, Ethan felt him everywhere. In the love he gave his own children, in the lessons he passed down, in the lives he helped through the community center, Daniel Whitaker had never been just a father. He had been a hero, and Ethan would spend the rest of his life making sure the world never forgot it. A father's love, a son's promise. Many years later, Ethan stood before a crowd, speaking at the anniversary celebration of the Whitaker Family Community Center. His hair had grayed. His hands had aged. But as he looked out at the people gathered before him, he saw the echoes of his father in every life he had touched. My father taught me that love is stronger than doubt, Ethan said, his voice steady. That sacrifice is the greatest form of love. And that being different is not something to be ashamed of. It's something to be proud of. He took a deep breath. I promised him I would honor his legacy. Ethan smiled. And I will spend the rest of my life keeping that promise. As the crowd applauded, Ethan looked up at the sky. And for a brief moment, he swore he could hear his father's voice. I'm proud of you, buddy. Ethan smiled. I know, Dad. And with that, he carried his father's love forward, forever. A son's promise fulfilled. The years following Daniel Whittaker's passing were not easy. Grief, like an old wound, never truly healed. It only became a part of Ethan, woven into the fabric of his life. There were days when he would catch himself reaching for the phone to call his father, only to remember he was gone. Nights when he would hear his father's voice in his dreams, only to wake up with tears in his eyes. But grief, for all its weight, was also a reminder of love, of sacrifice, of the man who had given him everything. And so, Ethan carried his father forward, not in mourning, but in legacy. The Whittaker Family Community Center. The Whittaker Family Community Center became more than just a building. It became a home. A place for struggling parents who felt alone. A place where children could come, play, and learn, just as Ethan once had with his father. A place where different didn't mean less. Ethan poured his heart into it, expanding programs for single parents, offering job training, childcare, and even a small food pantry for those in need. And every time he walked through its doors, he felt his father's presence, not in sorrow, but in pride. Teaching his own children, Ethan married a few years after his father's passing. His wife, Emily, was a woman with kind eyes and a heart as big as his father's. Together, they had 2 children, Thomas and Claire, named after their grandfather and mother. And from the moment they were old enough to understand, Ethan told them about their grandfather. Your grandpa Daniel was the strongest man I ever knew, Ethan would say, as they sat around the dinner table. But he wasn't a superhero, Thomas once pointed out. He didn't have powers. Ethan smiled. Oh, but he did. What were his powers? Claire asked, wide-eyed. He had the power to love without limits, to never give up, to see the best in people, even when the world didn't see the best in him. Thomas scrunched his nose. That's not a real superpower. Ethan chuckled. It's the greatest one. And as he tucked his children into bed that night, he realized he was passing his father's lessons forward. One bedtime story at a time. The final goodbye. One crisp autumn afternoon, years after his father's passing, Ethan visited Daniel's grave. The cemetery was quiet, the leaves rustling in the breeze. Ethan knelt down, brushing a few fallen leaves from the simple headstone. Daniel Whittaker, loving father, devoted friend. Love is stronger than doubt. Ethan smiled softly. I kept my promise, Dad, he murmured. I made sure the world remembers you. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I still miss you, he admitted. I probably always will. Silence. A single breeze swept through the trees, rustling the golden leaves around him. Ethan closed his eyes, letting the moment settle. Then, with a final pat to the headstone, he stood. I love you, Dad. And with that, he walked away, not with grief, but with gratitude. Because Daniel Whittaker was never truly gone. He lived in every lesson Ethan taught. In every life, the community center helped. In the laughter of his grandchildren. In the love that had shaped generations. And as long as Ethan lived, his father's story would never end. A legacy of love. Years later, long after Ethan had become an old man himself, his own son, Thomas, stood before a crowd at the anniversary celebration of the Whittaker Family Community Center. His voice, steady and proud, echoed through the hall. My father, Ethan, built this place in honor of his father. And today, we carry that legacy forward. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the gathered faces. My grandfather, Daniel Whittaker, was a man the world doubted, a man many people underestimated. He smiled. But what they didn't know, what they never understood, was that he was the greatest man I never had the chance to meet. Thomas took a deep breath. He proved that love is stronger than judgment, that sacrifice is the greatest gift a parent can give, and that being different is not something to be ashamed of, but something to be proud of. The crowd clapped, and somewhere Ethan sat, watching, his heart full. His father's legacy, his life's purpose, had been fulfilled. And as he closed his eyes, he swore he could hear his father's voice. "I'm proud of you, buddy." Ethan smiled. "I know, Dad." And with that, the Whittaker family story continued, etched not just in memory, but in the hearts of every life they touched. A story of love, a story of strength, a story that would never end.